All right, diving in today, folks, we're tackling something pretty important, making work safer.
Absolutely.
And we've got a fantastic set of ergonomic checkpoints to work through, covering everything from, well, the obvious stuff like noise and vibration hazards,
Right.
to some of the maybe less obvious dangers like those posed by electricity, chemicals. Oh, and, we can't forget about biological hazards either. So really, the aim here is to equip everyone listening with the knowledge to not just identify, but actually address these risks head on.
I think that's a really important point to emphasize.
Yeah.
It's one thing to be aware of these hazards, but it's quite another to actually know what to do about them.
Exactly.
And that's where I think this deep dive really comes in handy.
100%. Okay, so let's jump right in. And I think a natural starting point is noise. I mean, it's something we all experience, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's so easy to kind of just accept it as part of the background. But the thing is, noise can quickly become a real hazard. Once you hit those sustained levels of, let's say, 85 to 90 dBA, you're entering a danger zone.
And that's the point where just having a normal conversation at arm's length becomes pretty difficult.
Exactly. You start having to shout just to be heard.
Right.
And at that level, you're looking at potential hearing damage, not to mention the fact that, loud noise can easily mask important warnings and just generally mess with communication.
Setting the stage for accidents.
Precisely.
So what can we actually do about it? I mean, the sources we've got here lay out some really practical solutions.
Yeah, for sure.
And one that jumps out is the idea of, enclosing noisy machinery.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't always have to be a complete enclosure. Even a partial one can make a big difference.
Absolutely.
Another key strategy is, well, just keeping that loud equipment as isolated as possible. Using screens or partitions can really help with that. Now, when it comes to personal protection, earplugs and muffs, those are essential. But it's not just about providing them. It's also about training folks on how and when to use them properly.
Yeah, that's so important. You can have the best ear protection in the world, but if people don't know how to use it correctly or when they should be using it, it's not going to be very effective.
It defeats the purpose completely. Okay, so we've talked about minimizing noise at the source. What about maintaining a quieter environment, just generally?
Yeah, well, regular maintenance is huge. Making sure those loose parts are tightened, using those screw-on mufflers for pneumatic tools, even considering replacing that really loud, outdated equipment.
That's a good point.
And, sound-absorbing materials on walls and ceilings, that can help to dampen the overall noise level as well. But I think a really critical point to keep in mind is when you're implementing these noise control measures, you have to make sure that they're not actually going to block essential communication.
Right. That's kind of counterproductive.
Exactly. You might even need to consider using visual signals in some cases.
Right.
And even with ear protection, you have to make sure that those really critical sounds, the ones that could signal danger, are still audible.
Okay, moving on. Let's talk about vibration.
Okay.
This is something you feel rather than hear, right?
Right.
And whether it's coming from, those power tools we were just talking about or heavy machinery, it can lead to some real problems.
Oh, for sure.
You're talking about muscle and joint issues, problems with circulation, like that condition known as white finger disease. And then there's whole body vibration.
Right.
Which isn't just uncomfortable, it also comes with its own set of risks.
Absolutely.
So what can we do to minimize this kind of hazard?
Well, for handheld tools, those vibration-isolated handles are really important,
Okay.
as are absorbing gloves.
Yeah.
Also, minimizing continuous use and providing supports for the tools.
Makes sense.
Now, for whole body vibration, better seat suspension and cushioning can make a huge difference.
And just like with noise, regular equipment maintenance can go a long way, and even rotating job tasks so folks aren't exposed to that constant vibration for too long.
Exactly. And, it might sound surprising, but even just keeping warm in cold environments can help.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and minimizing your grip force.
Okay.
All those little things can add up.
Right. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about electrical hazards. Now, these are often, invisible, but definitely not something we should ignore.
Right.
And portable electric equipment, especially when you're working in damp conditions, poses a real risk of shock.
Absolutely.
Worn cables, exposed wires, that's just asking for trouble.
Yeah, you really have to be careful with that stuff.
So what are some key things to look out for when it comes to electrical safety?
Well, first and foremost, you want to make sure you're selecting well-insulated equipment with, robust heat-resistant cables.
Okay.
And grounding the equipment properly unless you're using a low-voltage transformer.
Right.
And, of course, regular checks for damage are crucial. Make sure those protective frames are intact.
Makes sense.
And ensure that all your wiring and light connections are secure. That's really important.
Yeah, no loose wires hanging about.
Exactly. And this should go without saying, but any frayed cables need to be replaced immediately. No exceptions.
Right.
And any cables that are just lying on the floor, those need to be protected. You don't want people tripping over them or damaging them accidentally.
Absolutely. Okay, now let's dive into another area where vigilance is key. Chemical hazards.
Yeah, this is a big one.
And the first thing that comes to mind is proper labeling. I mean, all those containers need to be clearly labeled, no question about it.
Right.
Clear warnings, instructions for use, storage, disposal, a breakdown of what's actually inside.
Yeah, it's all about transparency.
And it needs to be in plain language that everyone can understand.
Absolutely. You don't want any ambiguity when it comes to hazardous chemicals. Yeah. And of course, safe storage is equally important, keeping those chemicals away from heat and any incompatible substances.
So ideally, we want to minimize the risk right at the source.
Exactly.
So can you use a less hazardous alternative? Can you enclose the process with proper ventilation?
Yeah, those are great questions to ask. And things like local exhaust systems and fume hoods are essential for controlling those hazardous fumes.
Right.
And of course, comprehensive training is a must. Illustrated instructions, guidance on using the right personal protective equipment.
So talking about gloves, goggles, respirators, that sort of thing?
Exactly. And making sure people understand how and when to use them properly.
Now, our deep dive also covered confined spaces, things like tanks and pits.
Right.
And these present a really unique combination of dangers. You've got the atmospheric hazards, the physical hazards, the whole 9 yards.
Absolutely. You know, these spaces can be deceptively dangerous.
So what's the golden rule when it comes to working in these environments?
Permit required entry. No question about it. And that means qualified personnel have to issue those permits to trained workers only after they've done a thorough risk assessment.
Right.
And before anyone even steps foot in there, you have to carefully monitor the oxygen levels and check for the presence of any toxic or explosive substances.
Makes sense.
Adequate ventilation is absolutely essential. And if you can't maintain those safe levels, then supplied air respirators are non-negotiable.
Okay.
And once someone is inside a confined space, strict adherence to safety protocols and the use of appropriate PPE are paramount.
Right.
Along with, of course, regular refresher training. You can never be too careful in those environments.
Absolutely. All right, finally, let's wrap up by looking at biological hazards.
Okay.
So things like contaminated materials, infectious waste, how do we protect ourselves from these kinds of hazards?
Well, it all starts with good basic hygiene practices and thorough biosafety training. I mean, those are the foundation.
Right.
And then it's about implementing exposure control plans and just being really consistent in using those safety measures.
Thank you.
Providing accessible hand washing facilities.
Oh.
Using, clearly labeled secure containers for those contaminated materials. Those are all crucial steps.
Yeah.
And in situations where there is potential exposure, consistent use of gloves, protective clothing, masks, eye protection, that's non-negotiable.
Absolutely.
And maintaining good hygiene in those higher risk workplaces like livestock barns, labs, healthcare facilities, that's just common sense.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the roar of machinery to the unseen dangers of chemicals and those tricky confined spaces. But I think the real takeaway is that being proactive about prevention is key.
100%.
Understanding the risks, putting those practical controls in place, that's what really safeguards everyone.
Exactly. And, I would encourage everyone listening to think about their own experiences.
Yeah.
Are these ergonomic checkpoints being addressed in the spaces you encounter?
That's a good question.
I mean, what's one seemingly small adjustment that could actually make a significant difference in safety and comfort?
Right.
It's about cultivating that culture where safety is always top of mind.
Yeah, making it a priority.
Absolutely.
So, thinking about all the things we've discussed, what struck you as the most, maybe surprising or easily overlooked hazard?
That's a tough one. There's so much to consider.
I know, right? And what's one simple action, something that could be taken today to address it?
That's a great challenge for everyone listening.
It is, isn't it? Okay, well, on that note, thanks for diving deep with us, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
We'll catch you next time.
Sounds good.